For our last output, we are looking at a paired samples t-test. And in this particular data set, a researcher is interested in seeing if peak vastus medialis activity is the same for a squat in an upright position versus a horizontal position. Okay, so we're looking at, or interested in looking at, the difference between two groups. And I can include this in your guys' copy since it wasn't super clear here, but if we look at our exam 2 data, which are hiding, I think, behind my output, there we go. If we look at this, we can see if each row is representing a subject number, we have 2 total measurements for each person, right? Maybe we have them do a squat in standing versus a squat on a Pilates reformer. And then we measured their vastus medialis activity as a percentage of maximal voluntary isometric contraction. So all of these are actually percentages in terms of the units, which I can also add on here in your guys' copy. So given that information, we want to know if we met our assumptions or not. So in SPSS, you guys would have calculated the different scores and then run a normality test on those different scores, as well as generated a box plot to identify if there are any significant outliers. So on our output, I've included the test for normality, where you're specifically looking at the Shapiro-Wilk test, and more specifically the p-value for the Shapiro-Wilk test. Okay, so in this case, our p-value is 0.013. Which is less than 0.05. That tells us we reject the null hypothesis. And the null hypothesis for a Shapiro-Wilk test is that our sample distribution is normally distributed, right? So in this case, we would interpret this as different scores are not normally distributed because we have rejected the null hypothesis. Okay. Again, I've noted to keep continuing the analysis if assumptions are violated. The primary goal for you guys looking at these is so that I know that you know how to interpret each of the assumptions. Okay, but we're not going to worry about how violations are affecting our actual results for this class, just for the sake of the example. Okay. Our next question is asking if there are any significant outliers of the different scores. If yes, list the subject or subjects that are the significant outliers. So in our box plot, recall that SPSS will give you 2 different types of symbols. If you have a circle identifying an outlier, that is an outlier that is greater than 1.5 times the interquartile range. For our purposes, these are not going to significantly affect the outcomes of the t-test, so we can keep these as not being significant outliers. If you have an outlier that has an asterisk, however, that would be greater than 3 times the interquartile range, so that would significantly impact the results of our test. Okay, so because of this, there's an asterisk on this one. The number located next to that asterisk is going to indicate the case number or the subject that is the outlier in concern. So for this one, we would be saying that yes, there are significant outliers, and the specific outlier is subject 14. Okay. For our main test, I've asked you to identify and interpret the value for the main effect. So if we scroll to our paired samples t-test, okay, we can see our sample statistics, or mean standard deviation sample size, And then we can see our t-test results. So this is telling us that we took the reformer VM activity and subtracted the standing VM activity, giving us a mean difference and a standard deviation of the difference. And then over here we have our t-statistic and our p-value for our t-test. So in this case, we have a p that is equal to 0.001, which we know is less than 0.05, which tells us to reject the null, right? And the null for a t-test is that there is no effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable, or there's no significant difference, right? So if we're rejecting that null hypothesis, we are then arguing that there is a significant difference in peak vastus medialis activity between standing or upright and reformer conditions. I've then asked you guys to identify and interpret Cohen's d effect size. So we'll start that there. Remember that when we have a paired samples t-test, we're given the mean difference and the standard deviation of the difference. So when we look at our effect size calculations, those are kind of the only two numbers that we need to calculate our effect size for a paired test. So our mean difference was 19.46889. Standard deviation of the difference is 21.10770. And our effect size is going to be mean difference divided by the standard deviation of the difference. And we'll round that to 2 decimal places. So we get an effect size of 0.92. Okay, so 0.92. And we would interpret this as there is a large effect size in peak VM activity between standing and reformer conditions. Okay. Remember that the criteria for Cohen's d effect size, those are listed in the SPSS output PowerPoints for the t-tests. So effect size usually at like 0.2 or 0.3 are considered on the small side, around 0.5 are medium effect sizes, and then greater than 0.8 are considered large effect sizes. Okay, so that concludes the examples that I have for this review session. Again, you should be able to identify and calculate and estimate p-values for t-statistics given a certain set of criteria. So please refer back to your practice examples for the calculations for those. And if you guys have any questions on the review for reasoning why I chose certain values or made certain decisions, I'm more than happy to answer those via email. I have posted in our news announcement the times and dates that I will be doing office hours. If these times do not work for you and you still have questions and you want to meet over Zoom, please let me know and we can find a time that works for both of us to schedule in a Zoom call for like privately. All right. Good luck studying. Hopefully things are going well. You pretty much just have your activity discussion and quiz 6 due today. And then the rest of the week you have open to study. No assignments are due next week unless you feel like you want to do the extra credit review quiz, which is just going to take a bunch of random questions from the review. So if you've done the review with me with this video, you should be able to get 100% on that review quiz.